Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a plunge into, well, what is really the bedrock of material science, the principles of metallurgical thermodynamics.
It's absolutely foundational. Before we can even start to ask why a steel alloy transforms at a certain temperature or, figure out the energy needed to refine an ore, we have to speak the language.
The language of transformation.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to build that conceptual framework, to understand energy, stability, and change in materials, especially at the very high temperatures that we see in metallurgy.
Okay, so let's unpack that. When I think thermodynamics, I think physics, heat engines.
Yeah.
But for materials, there's this core trade-off, right? What's the fundamental approach that makes classical thermodynamics so powerful, but also, I guess, limited?
Well, what's so fascinating is that its strength is its simplicity. It's all about the macroscopic view.
Macroscopic, so big picture.
Big picture, exactly. Classical thermodynamics completely ignores what individual atoms are doing. It only deals with bulk systems. We're talking millions and millions of molecules. It doesn't care about the microscopic path the reaction takes.
It just cares about the start and the
The
finish.
start and the finish. That's it. And that's where its power comes from. The laws we derive from it are totally independent of a material's specific structure.
Ah, so that's why it works for steam, for iron, for pretty much anything. It achieves that universality through generalization.
Precisely. But here's the catch. The critical limitation for metallurgists. Because it ignores that internal atomic path, it can tell you if a transformation is possible, if it thermodynamically wants to happen, but it can never tell you how fast.
That's the kinetics part.
That's the realm of kinetics, and that huge gap is what keeps materials engineers in a job.
Right. And this whole field, of course, has a pretty deep history. It wasn't just invented overnight. These concepts were built piece by piece.
Oh, absolutely. The foundations were laid back in the mid-19th century. You start with someone like James Joule, who figured out the equivalence of heat and mechanical work. That's really the grounding for the first law for energy conservation.
Then you had Carnot.
Then Carnot, yeah. His work on heat engines gave us the framework for the second law, introducing these huge concepts of reversible and irreversible cycles.
And what was the pivot? The thing that took us from general physics to specifically chemical thermodynamics.
That was Josiah Willard Gibbs, late 19th century. His introduction of the Gibbs free energy function was just monumental. It gave us a single, practical way to figure out if a system was in equilibrium at a constant temperature and pressure.
And that's what everything else is built on.
That's the foundation that established chemical thermodynamics by about the 1930s.
So metallurgical thermodynamics is just that framework, but applied at extreme temperatures.
That's exactly right. It's chemical thermodynamics applied to things like extractive metallurgy, pulling pure metal from or phase transformations in alloys. And the reason it matured so late, we're talking the 1960s, maybe 70s, it was purely a technology problem.
It was just too hard to measure things.
It was incredibly challenging to get accurate, reproducible measurements for things like enthalpy and free energy at the crazy high temperatures you need for making steel or ceramics.
Okay, so to build our framework, we have to start with the absolute basics, defining the boundaries. We start with the system.
Right. The system is just the specific bit of matter we decide to look at. Everything else, the furnace, the room, the atmosphere, that's all the surrounding.
And choosing that boundary is the first big decision.
It is. But there's one really hard rule for any thermodynamic analysis. The system has to be chemically stable. You can't analyze something that's, constantly exploding. The relationships just break down.
So we classify these systems based on how they interact with the surroundings. You've got an open system, which is messy, it exchanges matter and energy.
Think of a cup of molten slag just sitting there. It's cooling, so it's losing energy, and it's giving off fumes, so it's losing matter.
Then the one that's really important for the theory, the closed system.
The closed system is key. It only exchanges energy, not matter. The classic example is a gas sealed in a cylinder with a piston. You can heat it or do work on it, but the amount of gas doesn't change.
And almost all the powerful thermodynamic laws are derived, assuming that closed system model, right?
Pretty much all of them.
Yeah.
It just simplifies the math so much. And then, theoretically, you have the isolated system, which exchanges nothing, but that's not really possible in practice.
And systems are also defined by what's inside them, their uniformity.
Right. A homogeneous system is uniform all the way through. It's a single phase, like a beaker of pure liquid copper. A heterogeneous system is non-uniform. It has multiple distinct phases, like liquid iron with a solid layer of oxide on top and maybe some slag.
Okay, system defined. Now we need a snapshot of it. The state of a system. How do we describe that?
You describe it with its state variables, the
Mm.
things you can actually go and measure. Temperature, pressure, volume, and its composition.
And the neat thing is you don't have to measure everything. You just need the independent state variables.
Exactly. That's the minimum set you need. For a simple gas, for instance, you just need 2 out of the 3T, P or V. Once you fix those 2, the third one is locked in.
And everything else, like density or viscosity, becomes a dependent state variable.
Their values are completely fixed once the independent ones are set. And that's a huge simplification for an engineer. You don't need to measure 50 different properties if knowing 2 or 3 tells you everything else.
This brings us to a really key distinction about properties based on scale. Extensive versus intensive.
Yeah, this is all about whether the property depends on how much stuff you have. Extensive properties depend on the quantity of matter. They're additive.
So mass, volume. If I have 2 blocks of steel, the total mass is just the sum of the 2 masses.
Right. Total energy is also extensive, but intensive properties are independent of the amount of matter. They are not additive.
Like temperature. If I mix 2 cups of water at 50 degrees, the final temperature is still 50 degrees, not 100.
Exactly. Pressure and density are also intensive, and the connection between them is really useful for engineers. If you take the ratio of 2 extensive properties, like total volume divided by total mass, you get density.
So you strip out the size dependence.
You do. And that lets you define standard measurements that apply to any system, no matter how big your industrial reactor is.
So we have our static snapshot, the system, its state variables. But the interesting part is when things change. How does the idea of a process connect one state to another?
A thermodynamic process is really just the path the system takes when it goes from state 1 to state 2. And we name them based on what we hold constant along that path.
So you have isothermal, where temperature is constant, isobaric, constant pressure, and isochoric, constant volume.
Yep. And then there are 2 others that are really critical for metallurgy, adiabatic and polytropic.
Adiabatic means no heat exchange, right?
Right, delta Q equals 0. It's an idealization, really. It applies to processes that happen so fast that heat just doesn't have time to flow, or for a perfectly insulated system. The polytropic process, though, is the general case engineers use. It's defined by the equation P times V to the power of N equals a constant.
And that N can change depending on the process.
Exactly. It's a general equation that lets us model all sorts of complex, real-world processes.
Okay, now we have to tackle what is maybe the most crucial concept in this whole chapter, the difference between reversible and irreversible processes. The reversible one sounds completely hypothetical. It's infinitely slow, no friction. Why do we even care about a process that can't actually exist in a real furnace?
That's a brilliant question. And it gets to the very heart of why we use theory. We care because the reversible process sets the benchmark. It's the theoretical limit.
The ceiling for efficiency.
The absolute ceiling. It tells you the maximum possible useful work you could ever get out of a system, or the absolute minimum work you have to put in. Your real, messy, irreversible process is always going to be worse than that ideal.
So in the real world, we only ever see irreversible processes. They happen on their own, they move towards equilibrium, and they waste energy through things like friction.
Exactly. And if you were to plot this on a pressure volume diagram, where the area under the curve is the work done, the reversible path gives you the biggest area during an expansion. That means W reversible is always greater than W reversible.
More work done by the system.
Right. And for compression, it's the opposite. The irreversible path is always above the reversible one, meaning you have to put more work in to get the same result.
And this idea of path dependence leads us straight to the big mathematical simplification in thermodynamics, the difference between state functions and path functions.
This is where it all clicks into place. State functions, and these are the big ones, like Gibbs free energy, G, enthalpy H, entropy S. They are completely independent of the path you take.
They only care about the start and the end point.
That's it. You can run a system through some crazy complex cycle, but when you get back to where you started, the total change in, say, internal energy is 0.
But the path functions, which are heat, Q, and work, W, they depend entirely on the path you took.
Completely. And that mathematical fact is what makes all of our calculations possible. Because the change in G or H is path independent, we just need to measure the initial and final states, the temperatures, the pressures, to calculate the total energy change. We don't have to track every little chaotic fluctuation during the messy real-world process itself.
It's a massive simplification.
Events.
So once a process finishes, the system's ultimate goal is always to reach a state of equilibrium. This is its most stable state, where nothing changes anymore as long as the conditions are fixed.
And we can generalize this idea using the zeroth law. Originally, that was just about temperature, but for true, complete equilibrium in a complex metallurgical system, you actually need three things.
Okay, what are they?
You need thermal equilibrium, so uniform temperature everywhere, no more heat flow. You need mechanical equilibrium, which means uniform pressure, no bulk movement. And you need chemical equilibrium.
And the chemical equilibrium is the tough one for materials. From a kinetics view, it's when the forward and reverse reactions happen at the same rate. But what's the thermodynamic definition?
Thermodynamically, the condition is that the differential of the right thermodynamic potential has to be zero. For most of our processes, which happen at constant temperature and pressure, that means the change in Gibbs free energy has to be zero. Delta G equals zero.
If that condition is met, the system is stable. It's at its lowest possible energy state.
Correct. But equilibrium isn't always absolute, which brings up the really fascinating idea of metastability.
Right, so stable equilibrium is simple. You push it, it bounces back. But metastable, what is that exactly?
Metastable equilibrium is absolutely critical to metallurgy. The system is in a kind of pseudo-equilibrium. It changes so slowly that it seems perfectly stable, sometimes for centuries, even though there's another state out there with an even lower energy.
And the classic example, the one everyone learns in their first materials class, is cementite, iron carbide, Fa3C.
Yes, cementite is technically metastable. If you gave it an infinite amount of time, it should decompose into pure iron and graphite because that configuration has a lower overall Gibbs free energy.
But it doesn't.
It doesn't, because the energy barrier to start that decomposition is so incredibly high at room temperature that it just persists. It acts like it's stable, and it forms the backbone of countless useful steels. Understanding that gap between what should happen thermodynamically and what actually happens kinetically is, well, it's central to modern materials design.
So looking back at all these definitions, why spend all this time on them? What does this foundational knowledge actually let us do in the real world of, say, a steel mill?
Oh, it governs every single major decision. Metallurgical thermodynamics tells us if a process is even feasible. Can we actually make this reaction happen in an economic way? It lets us calculate energy requirements, heat balances, which tells you how big your furnace needs to be and what your fuel bill is going to look like.
And most importantly, it dictates the stability of the phases you're trying to make.
Exactly. And those definitions of process types and state functions, they're necessary because they tell us which specific simplified equations we're allowed to use to calculate things like work.
Right, like in those solved problems, if you have an isothermal reversible expansion, you can use a simple formula.
Exactly. You know, the process is isothermal, so you can just use the formula W equals nRT times the natural log of V2 over V1. The definition tells you which tool to pull out of the toolbox.
Or for something more general like a polytropic process, this framework lets engineers use that general work equation, W equals P2V2 minus P1V1, all divided by 1 minus eta.
Right. And the definition of the process changes what that eta term, the polytropic index, actually is. If we define the process as reversible and adiabatic, no heat exchange, we know that eta becomes gamma, the ratio of specific heats.
So you have to define the system and the path first.
You have to. Only then can you pick the right equation to predict the energy involved, which, in a big industrial reactor, can be tens of thousands of joules for every kilomole of material.
So as you move on from here, maybe to the first law and beyond, it seems like there are three key fundamentals to keep locked in. First, classical thermodynamics is this powerful macroscopic tool that only cares about the start and the end state. It ignores the messy details in between.
Second, that mathematical difference between state functions like G and H, which don't care about the path, and path functions like heat and work, which absolutely do. That's probably the biggest conceptual simplification we have.
And finally, complete equilibrium requires uniformity of temperature, pressure, and chemical potential. But we can't forget the nuance. Many materials we use every day, like cementite, exist in a metastable state. It proves that in engineering, sometimes stable just means extremely slow.
Which leads to a provocative thought. If cementite, a material we all rely on, is thermodynamically just waiting to change, but it takes centuries,
Yeah.
what other modern high-performance materials are currently living on borrowed time? And what is the next generation of material science doing to manipulate those energy barriers to create even more useful metastable materials?
We hope these fundamentals serve you well as you continue your exploration. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.